this year's edition is going to be very, very interesting. There have been a few twists that we've added based on the experience that we had last year. So last year, so just to give a little background, the PhD workshop is usually a precursor event to the annual conference. And so previously, these used to be physical events. But last year, when there was COVID, the conference was postponed. But then we thought it would be possible to host the workshop virtually. And we did so to great success. So taking on the learnings from last year, where we saw that there was great interest in publishing, in how to get published as a scholar. We have a very interesting lineup of speakers in the professional development workshop elements of this year's workshop. So we've got 3 speakers who are going to be speaking during the professional development workshop. So we've got Zachariah Mampili, who's the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at City University, New York. We've got Morgan Kaplan, who's the departing executive editor of International Security, which is a journal. And I've also got Jessica Weininger, who's the co-editor of the Political and Legal Anthropology Review. So it was interesting. So Zachariah also does some work around increasing the participation of African scholars in the production of knowledge around civil society in Africa, and we had a conversation as well. And he was very excited to be part of this event. And so that session is going to be a bit more enlarged than it usually is, because we've got a couple of people who will be attending beyond the students who are receiving feedback on their proposals just now. So we've got, so Ronnie, your colleagues from the LTFP, we've also invited them to be part of the professional development workshop, because we know that a number of them have expressed interest in wanting to pursue undertake some academic pursuits. We're also inviting the students the scholars who received grants from us to undertake their research. So they are the research grantees from last year who received grants early this year and who will be presenting their papers at the conference tomorrow. We've also invited them to be part of the professional development workshop, because we thought it's also important to them to learn a thing or two about how to successfully publish articles in international peer-reviewed journals. So beyond that, everything else is as normal. We'll start with the initial opening remarks, which Esi is going to give. So Esi has been with AROCSA from the very beginning. She is part of the founding members of AROCSA. She's been at the heart of it. She basically, well, we look at her as our mother in AROCSA, myself and Amina. She might not fancy us saying that. That is how we look at Esi. So Esi will give the opening remarks, and then Dr. Katie as well will come in and give the keynote address. After that, we'll go into the breakout sessions where the faculty will be able to give direct feedback to the students who share their research proposals. When we come back from the breakout sessions, we take a break and then we go into the professional development workshop. And then after the workshop, there'll be a Q&A which Zachariah will moderate. And then there'll be a final Q&A at the end. And that should be it. So without further ado, I will allow Esi to give the opening remarks and we'll get it started.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shani. And I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Wonderful. So I thought I would share a few words on why we do this. Why would AROCSA, in partnership with others, look to run a workshop like this? And the reason is actually very simple. And it has to do with the gaps we've observed through research, through our own personal experiences as scholars, and also because we see the abundance of opportunities around us. And so one of the key reasons why we're doing this is because quite often getting feedback is not always easy. And when you're working with a supervisor and a committee, you tend to get a lot of information shared and a lot of feedback from one perspective. And the value of a session like this is opening you up to people who may have experience and knowledge that complements what you're working on as a scholar. And so this forum is to really create the opportunity for you to get a little more comprehensive feedback on your research project. And then also one of the things that we note amongst African scholars is the need, well, it's a major gap for us, context. When you're a student on the continent, you find that a lot of the resources you use come from off the continent, from everywhere else in the world. And you will have some African content, but it tends to be limited. Whether you're looking at nonprofit management with a lot of information generated from other parts of the world, civil society organizations, and the issues that are important to us around literacy and justice and inclusion, etc. And so one of the main reasons for a forum like this is to help give context. And so you'll note that faculty and facilitators come from different parts of the world. The richness in different perspectives and helping to give you context, so that when you're talking about something in Liberia, you may have a professor who's based in an American university, has done work in Liberia. You may have an African policymaker who is familiar with the context, and you're getting feedback from everyone. And so very important that we share contextual knowledge and insights so that your work can actually be a lot more useful and practical to those of us on the continent. And another gap and opportunity that we note is the fact that we have a lot of knowledge and experience amongst African scholars. We have done a poor job of documenting that. And so this provides a great opportunity to pour and invest in scholars so that you're hearing directly from colleagues and other scholars, senior scholars, getting insights into their work, their perspectives, which ultimately is to enrich your work and make it practical. For me, that's extremely important. If you walk through the University of Ghana, if you walk through Makerere and many of the universities on the continent, you find a lot of valuable information in our libraries. A lot sits in our libraries on shelves as dissertations. Students are done, they've done fantastic work and they've moved on. And the value of a session like this is getting feedback so that you can figure out how, to take the knowledge you are generating and be able to share it with relevant communities, relevant practitioners, relevant, other scholars, and people who can take your work and carry it forward. And other people who can implement some of your ideas, engage in some of the inquiry along with you. And so for me, this is a really important platform for African scholars, regardless of where you are in the world. And I would encourage everyone who's joining to take advantage of this, use the opportunity to network and to get great input and insights. 3 things that I'll leave you with. 1, be open to learning. While you are in this session, don't presume that you are the only expert in your area. And so be open to learning from other scholars, peers, seniors, juniors. Just openness, I think, is important. 2, be willing to share. Be willing to share because of where you find yourself. your local context, your academic training, your practical experience, your encyclopedic knowledge, in essence, you know, everything that you're coming to the table with, it puts you in a position where we can learn from you, others can learn from you. And so I hope that you can position yourself to share. And so when the conversations are going on and perhaps you found a way around research design that has really worked for you, you've used a method that you found very useful, it would be great for you to share it with others who are also in your session. So be open to learn, be willing and ready to share. And then lastly, look for opportunities to collaborate. Look for opportunities to collaborate so that at the end of the day, you're working hand in hand with others. These days, a lot of research grants and fellowships are looking for collaboration, institutional collaboration, collaboration amongst scholars. And so the one man, one woman paper submissions and research projects are being replaced with multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research needs and interests and funding opportunities. And so take advantage of this to collaborate. And if you find yourself in a session and unable to join another session you'd have loved to be part of, use the opportunity to go through the schedule, identify the person, and the AROCSA Secretariat will be willing to put you in touch if it so happens you didn't engage with the person in any of the breakout rooms, etc. So be open to learning, be willing to share, and be looking for opportunities to collaborate. And as we plunge into this, I wish everyone all the very best. Thank you, Katie and Kelly and everybody who's joining our effort. And my hope is that at the end of this, we would have fulfilled our vision of bridging the gap between scholarship and practice on the continent through the research that you're doing. So thank you very much. And over to you, Shani. Let's carry this forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Esi. And so I see that a couple more people have joined just while Esi was speaking. And so for those who are just joining, I should introduce myself. So my name is Shani Nomi Eribo, the programs director at AROCSA. You can call me Shani for short. You just listened to Esi Ansah, who's a board member of AROCSA, speaking. She's based in Ghana. She was just giving the welcome remarks, sort of setting the context for why we are doing the workshop and the reason why we do it. And so now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Katie Bryant, who's sort of going to be, delivering the keynote address. And her talk is titled Rhetorical Savvy, a tool to proactively construct your scholarly identity. Dr. Katie, you're welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Shani. So I'll just put my screen on for a second, but I'm also going to share my screen. So well, maybe not see me, but at least see my screen. Is that technically things are working, I hope?
Yes, I can see.
Yes, we see and hear you.
Great, great. Oh, good. Okay, excellent. In the context I'm working in, usually we don't share our screens, so I hope I'm not impacting anyone's bandwidth. Do let me know if there's any issues. So I just want to thank Shani and AROCSA for inviting me here today to talk and to share some insights from my own work. Currently, I'm here I'm in Botswana right now, but I currently work in South Africa, outside of Durban, in Umlazi, which is a township, as I said, just outside of Durban, at Mangosuthu University of Technology. And I'm there working with the university to help them open their first university writing center, as well as to work with emerging scholars, new scholars who are trying to build their own research identities. And this is work I've been doing for quite a while. In different contexts. I am originally Canadian and have spent a long time also working in the Canadian university context, specifically at Carleton University. And I thought when I would start today, I wanted to just actually sort of begin with a story. I think stories are often, a way in which we can familiarize ourselves and sometimes garner attention from our audience, right? And I wanted I wanted to start with a story about the Writing Center, because I know many of you are embarking, maybe transitionally, you're moving into an academic career, or you're starting your PhD work. And I want to talk about why someone like myself, who works in a writing center context in a university, might be here today to talk about the issue of publication rates coming from scholars on the African continent. And I actually want to start with a story about my own experience as a writer in the academic context, or in the university context, to perhaps inform some of your own, to help you kind of understand where I'm coming from. So most of the work that I do research-wise actually comes from listening to people's stories. I listen to their stories about the work they're doing in their own research writing, and I also, as a researcher, listen to people's stories. And I think stories are a really important way, and I encourage you, those of you who are embarking on your research work, to start thinking about your own stories as researchers, right? And I share this quote to you from Camilla Gibbs. She's a Canadian author, and she's really talked about the importance of stories, and it's informed my own kind of thinking about the value of stories in research work. And she says, we come to know ourselves only through stories, right? We listen to the stories of others, we inherit the stories of those who came before, and we make sense of our own experiences by constructing a narrative that holds us together, and stories are how we make sense of our lives. And when it maybe makes, those of us who are researchers, we think, okay, what value does story have in our lives as researchers, or the research work we do? And I would argue that, by me telling these stories that I will share with you today, both of my own experiences, but also the stories of the people that I've done research with, that you can it can help you sort of shape this critical juncture that you're at in your own shaping of your identity of becoming a scholar. Particularly, and how rhetorical savvy can play a role in that. And, especially for those of us who are working as researchers on the African continent, I think rhetorical savvy becomes particularly important for us. And I'll try to illustrate why through my talk today. And I know, and this isn't, don't necessarily think this is a fair reason why rhetorical savvy is so important, but it's something that we do need to think about. So I'm going to start my story at the University Writing Center, where I actually did my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and that's Carleton University. And it's also the location where so much of my own professional and academic identity was constructed. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the University Writing Center, and I don't know how many of you are based at universities that have writing centers. I think many of us on the African continent, it's not really a phenomenon at our universities, right? Which, and probably underline, or the subtext of my conversation and all of my discussion today and all of my research work is really about how the lack of writing centers and really empirically informed writing support at our universities on the African continent. It's a huge generalization, but it's worth looking introspectively at the places that we are all based on the continent to ask, how is writing support being done? And is there a writing center, and have I reached out to them? And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go on. In the North American context, particularly in the US, writing centers at universities are a very common phenomenon, right? And even though it's a common phenomenon, we often have very little funding, and we often struggle visibly in this very complex political arena that the university is. But what the core business typically of a university writing center is to help undergraduate, graduate, and even faculty members develop their abilities to write for academic as well as research purposes. At the undergrad level, typically we're writing to get grades, but as we become graduate students, we embark on our career as early researchers. We're really trying to learn how to write for research purposes in our discipline. So in the context of my own story, I came to the Writing Center as an undergraduate student with a very, I would say, dirty secret, if I can. So I was offered a job. I entered the Writing Center world many years ago, 2003, as a writing tutor. But I really needed to keep sort of on the down low all the struggles I myself had as a writer in the university setting. I really struggled to understand how did I use language in ways that would meet the expectations of my professors. And I don't mean language in terms of grammatical correctness. I mean in terms of using language in particular ways to achieve a particular purpose. It was really the notion of rhetoric, right? And although I struggled, it wasn't that I was failing. It was that I was struggling to get that elusive, high mark that it seems like many of my colleagues were getting. And I found this particularly strange because, I've been a strong student since primary school. I was an avid reader. I would write, but I still could not figure out how to be confident as a writer in the university context. And what do I mean by being confident? Oftentimes when I would submit a piece of writing, an essay or some type of research proposal or something at the undergraduate level, I would just have no idea what the response was going to be from the people who were grading it. I didn't understand. And I think other than feeling controlled, or rather than just feeling controlled in that sense, or feeling in control in that sense, I think that happened well before the submission process, and that I often procrastinated as a writer. I didn't know what I was doing. I really felt out of control rather than in control. The writing, the process was controlling me rather than vice versa. So, and I even think like there were times where you were crossing your fingers hoping you would get an A, and that kind of sigh of relief that you got it, as opposed to, there were other times you could be shedding tears in the bathroom with this poor grade that you had received, right? So fast forward to my beginnings in a writing center in which, as I said, I felt highly unqualified. I didn't want them to find out this dirty secret of the challenge I had been experiencing. Yet, once I arrived in this location, I realized how much research has actually been done to explicate the very challenge that I had faced my entire undergraduate career. If we look at this and, this image here, we have the professor, the teacher, and we see the students writing away. And we can see that as I put here, there's an array of different areas of research that have been done on why students might struggle with writing for academic purposes. And we can see that from the field of writing studies, applied linguistics, composition studies, English studies, and really these have been manifested in particular ways such as writing in the disciplines, writing across the curriculum, writing centers at universities. And although I've separated them here, for ease of discussion, I think really these all overlap in different ways as you start really to delve into the areas of research. But what I really want to emphasize, and hope I'm emphasizing from this visual here, is that this kind of action that's happening with the professor or the teacher and the students learning to write or being given a writing task in their classroom, this has been well investigated by these different fields of research. And so as I started working in this space, it normalized the challenges I had been experiencing, where I thought I was sort of the only one, right? And in addition to that, I started learning about theories and research about how I could really start to help students, as well as myself, gain control over the writing work that they were doing. And I don't want to make this a story of all positivity, right? It didn't mean that the pain that we all feel as writers and thinkers in our discipline causes us, it didn't dissipate completely, right? But I have to say, this experience working in a university writing center was completely life-changing for me, not only career-wise, but I mean, as a student, as a writer in my field, and as I move from different locations too, within the university and even outside of the university. So I want to fast forward a couple of years in where I become coordinator of a writing center. And I quickly, for those of us in academia, but they're everywhere, right? Learn about the politics of the university context. And what I found particularly interesting, though, in this role is I would often have faculty members come to me complaining about the writing that they were receiving from their students. And when I tried to talk to them about the evidence that we have from all of these fields of research here that I've shown you on the right or left hand of your screen, depending, and trying to talk about ways in which we could address those challenges, oftentimes there was a lack of uptake on the side of the faculty. And not only on the side of the faculty, but also from senior administration. And that's not all universities, I have to say. But there's some of the best universities in the world have employed very synergistic, multifaceted approach to help their students learn how to write for their disciplines of study. And it doesn't just stop at year one, right? This is something that goes through the trajectory of a student's academic career, all the way up to PhD, as well as maybe transitioning into their postgrad, or sorry, into their career as researchers. But for myself, it was something that in the context I was in was very kind of career stopping in some ways. So this sort of ends chapter one of this story, and it moves us into the next component of the story I want to share with you. But what I want to, thinking about the fact that we have new scholars in this context, maybe we also have faculty, people who support students, their own students, postgraduate students with their writing work, I just want to focus on some points of reflection. So what's important for all of us to understand as we embark particularly on our doctoral work is to understand that most of us struggle to write for research or what could be academic purposes. The second thing to understand or take away from the story I've just shared is that there's a lot of research that exists on this issue, and there's a lot of research that illustrates ways to overcome this struggle. Or let's say challenges. Struggle maybe is a bit too negative. Thirdly, is that the access to empirically informed writing support. So for those of you who are new PhD students, who are in the midst of your PhDs, I urge you, check at your university to see, is there a place at my university where I can access empirically this writing support that's based on research? It's not some, write your dissertation in 7 days or something like that. These are people who have been trained, often holding PhDs in fields like education, different places like that, and they can help you with your writing work. I put here that try it 3 times before you make a conscious decision. If you don't like one person you work with, try another. It's like, therapy or toothpaste. They say, try different brands, try different people, because you don't just jive with everyone, right? And then there is the last point I'd like to direct at faculty. if you have complaints, if you have challenges with the writing you're receiving from your students, always be aware that empirically informed support can be found at your university writing center. Please, though, understand the multifaceted ways in which this support needs to happen. It's not a quick fix. It's not a simple lesson on grammar. It's much more complex, as I'll talk about today, as we see from the stories I'll share from people I've worked with in one context. So based on that story, I want to move to another one, or the next chapter, let's say. And it's the story that moves away from the location of the writing center at a university, but not necessarily the theoretical foundations or working of this context. So after the frustrations I just described to you, I actually moved to the world of international development and funding work. And I started to work at Canada's International Development Research Centre. So for those of you who might be aware of Canada's IDRC, as it's typically referred to, it's a crown corporation, or some of you might know what it is, but for those of you who aren't, it's a crown corporation in which funding is basically distributed to researchers in the global south to address an array of issues that people in that context might be experiencing. So I moved to this location because I was really interested in this issue. And that's the issue of global publication rate disparities. And, you know, the differences, the vast differences, as this image from World Mapper shows us, of differences between those of us situated in the global north versus those of us situated in the global south. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this World Mapper image. There was one I think they produced in 2011, and I think this is the most current version, the 2016 version. And really what it shows us, as you can see there from at the bottom, is the territorial size is proportional to the number of scientific journals published in that year. So in 2016, basically the size of the continent or the size of the country represents how many journal articles were published. Now this is simply in, and I want to caution people, and I showed this image before, and I always get reminded, this is just in the disciplines related to the sciences, right? Things like physics, biochemistry, math, clinical medicine, biomedical research, engineering and technology, earth and space sciences. And World Mapper makes clear that they gather this information from national science foundations, and really that's based on the World Bank's World Development Indicators. So, of course, this, regardless of the fact that this is in the sciences, it's alarming to say the least, right? Particularly when we look at the African continent. And, if we want to shift our gaze to the social sciences, there's an article that Briggs and Weathers write in 2015. And what they did, very interestingly, is they looked at two journals, the two probably most prominent journals in the field of African politics, so African Affairs and the Journal of Modern and African Studies. And they wanted to see over a 21-year period, and so 1993 to 2013, they wanted to understand how frequently our authors from the African continent are being published in these journals, and how frequently are they being cited. And what they found is, over this period of time, actually, the number of articles that were accepted by African researchers, just in corresponding, obviously, to this image you see here, they declined. And there's also a much lower rate of citation of African scholars' work than those researchers who are not situated on the African continent. So as someone who's always been interested in the issue of social inequity, particularly in terms of whose knowledge and voices are heard in the academic context, I became really interested in this issue. But when I actually looked at the previous research that had been done, I'm just trying to see how I can get rid of this, because I hope you can all see my screen okay. When I looked at previous research that had been done on this issue, really a lot of the focus had been on macro level issues. So it had looked at things like a researcher's access to infrastructure, a researcher's access to information. I think we're all probably familiar with Walensky's publication in 2006. There's, in terms of the number of how many journals African libraries, the African university libraries can actually subscribe to and access information. And I think this, was advocating for and prior to the strong push we've probably seen in the last 15 years towards open access publishing. There's also a significant discussion on access to research funds, right? And not to discredit these things. I think these are very important arguments and necessary arguments and focal points in which we need to look at low publication rate issues. But I think one thing that was missing is the micro level focus, or there's a little bit of micro level focus, but is really, when we do look at that micro level focus and sort of what's down here in the lack of attention to scholarly work, there's a lot of discussion about African academics' supposed lack of skills in terms of writing. But what's unfortunate for the most part when I look at this literature is there's not really a discussion of these empirical ideas or this research that's coming from those fields I showed you on, that earlier screen, field research coming from fields of writing studies, of writing pedagogy, of different disciplines like that. So when there were many gaps that I have identified in that previous research. The first gap was really that a lot of the research was excluding the voices and experience of academics actually living and working in the context on the continent at different universities in different countries on the continent. And it's not to generalize, but it's when you look at the literature, we often don't hear from the academics themselves, particularly down here at the bottom, their experiences that are really related to using written language to get their research work done. There's a lot of focus also almost exclusively on the early stages of the research process. So if I go back to this slide, not having access to research funds, not having science granting councils in countries, lack of access to information, lack of access to infrastructure, bandwidth, things like, being able to keep your video on when you're actually in a Zoom conversation on the continent, it's quite difficult, right? So all of these things are at the early stage of the research process. But what happens as academics are actually engaging in their research work and writing about their research work? There's also, and I hope I don't fall I hope I don't this isn't accused of me today in my conversation or the stories I'm sharing with you, but there's also sort of this lack of acknowledgement of the complex differences between African countries. There's a lot of generalization. And if I go back to that article I just talked about, the article that looked at the two journals in the fields of African politics, one of the reasons, or when they looked at what scholars outside of the African continent were doing as they talked about issues on the African continent, typically what was happening is those scholars were generalizing, making a lot of generalizations, and then those generalizations were being cited by other academics who were publishing in that journal. So just a little thing to keep at the back of your head as I continue to talk today. Also, there's a lot of, when we look at that research, previous research on publication rate disparities, there's in some ways, there can be this narrative of Afro-pessimism. These issues depend solely on the African university, depends on the higher education context of that country, the country itself, the continent. At times, definitely Tefera and Altabach have recognized the role that colonialism, neocolonialism plays in these publication rate disparities, Kanagaraja as well. But there also can be a narrative of Afro-pessimism that sort of weaves its way into these discussions. And as I said, finally, As I read these articles or their previous research, I really struggled to find any discussion about empirically informed notions of writing, theories of writing, research on writing that really help to understand what might be happening as we delve in and really hone our focus on individual researchers in individual contexts in certain countries on the continent. So for my own self, my research work took me to Botswana, and I purposefully chose Botswana actually because, a lot of the issues that I had shown you before, issues like access to infrastructure, access to funding, things like that, in some ways, they have been addressed at the University of Botswana, which is one of the few public institutions in the country, located in Gaborone. Down here, you can see in the map on that's focused specifically on Botswana. And I was really interested in trying to understand what the academics, 13 different academics at this institution, were experiencing as they attempted to engage in their research work. So I sought to listen to their stories, in-depth stories of their experiences as researchers. And you can see from just this brief, this slide here, not to go through it in depth, but what I want to point out with this slide is that the researchers were coming from different disciplines. They were coming from both male and female, different places of origin were different, some African, some European, some different African countries, but the point of my research wasn't to look at where they were from originally, but really what were their experiences in the particular context in which they found themselves at the time. Now, these are all pseudonyms that I've given the academics that participated in my study. And the pseudonyms actually are all Setswana words that are based on key themes that emerge from the stories they told me. So for example, Dr. Kenosi, he told the story of being alone. And Kenosi in Setswana really is if we translate that word into English, is about being alone. I am alone is basically the literal translation into English. And he told stories of how alone he was in his discipline, doing his research work, and how that impacted his abilities to really successfully engage in this work. So you can see there's an array of experience. The least amount of experience was 8 years. Some people have been almost 40 years working in the university context. So what I want to do now is I want to shift far away from my story and move into their stories. And I want to talk about what they're, in light of these research questions. So my overarching question of this study, of this work that I was doing in this context, was really to understand, if we take an in-depth understanding of social context, one university, one country, what would we gain? What further insights might we have into low publication rates of research low rates of research participation from the African continent? Specifically, though, I wanted to understand if and how were academics at this university engaging in their research work, what were their social motives, and what challenges they might experience trying to join the conversations of their discipline. Specifically, being a writing researcher, I wanted to understand, as they use the genres of their discipline, but particularly the journal article and the conventions of those journal articles and of their disciplinary communities, what specific challenges might they experience? And in sharing the findings from this work, the findings that came from their stories, I think I have some takeaway points that I think are something to think about for your own self, albeit in different locations, but your own self as you're trying to build your own research careers in your own disciplines of study. So what I saw from listening to their stories, very interestingly, was there were 6 different ways in which academics in this context were engaging in research work. Some were just, they were engaged in, mostly what was very fascinating is low publication rates don't mean that people aren't doing research. Often, and it's similar to the finding of the study I talked about earlier, oftentimes it's when the dissemination process happens, the attempt at publication happens, that the research, that the researcher is getting prevented from joining their research community. People were engaged in research, they were disseminating it, sustaining practice. We can see all of those things, from here. They were furthering the national development program in their area of research in their country. They were trying to advance disciplinary knowledge, and they were also some were building the next generation of researchers in their discipline. I was really interested in social motive. Why were people doing this work? I was particularly interested because I was wondering, were certain social motives connected? People with certain social motives, was that connected potentially to their success or lack of success joining their disciplinary communities? And so there were four different categories, in a sense, of why people chose to engage in research work. Some to satisfy individual inclinations, some to respond, there's performance management systems or different requirements at the institution. Some wanted to do their research work to address a national or a community development challenge. And then some were doing this work to advance disciplinary knowledge or gain international exposure. What's important to note is it's not like one person was doing only one of these things, or a person had only one of these motives. Many had multiple motives, right, of these four. And I would urge all of you who are about to embark on your research careers to think about, what's your social motive for engaging in research? Finally, was the types of challenges people had joining their disciplinary conversations. And so what I just want to point out from this slide is people had challenges both at the research engagement stage as well as the research dissemination stage. And although I've separated these into two different models or two different kind of images, it's not that I'm saying that these two are not overlapping and connecting. On the contrary, they're very much overlapping and connecting, but I separate them out just for ease of kind of understanding. What these challenges resulted in is basically two different groups of researchers at this institution. We had academics who had fewer challenges in these regards, in these different areas, and those people I would call people who had membership. People who had membership in the communities, research communities, access to publish in the journals that they wanted to publish in. And in contrast, obviously, there were academics who were on the periphery. These were people keep in mind, these are imagined research communities, right? But academics who were on the periphery were people who struggled to publish in these most sought after, the most prestigious journals of their field. And they often had to resort to publishing in what they call quote unquote local journals, national journals, perhaps regional journals that weren't necessarily as prestigious nor as well read as other journals, that these more sought after prestigious journals. What's important to take away, though, is these challenges weren't something that were inherent or solely individualistic. They were highly entangled, as Sarah Nuttall talks about. They were entangled in these really complex social and institutional contexts in which the academics were situated. What I want to focus on and what I want to take away, and this whole idea of rhetorical savvy comes from, is those academics with membership. These are the characteristics all of them seem to emanate, the characteristics they seem to have. Again, these aren't sort of biological characteristics, right? But as I listened to the stories they told me, these were characteristics that they seem to, they are ways in which they enacted themselves or conducted themselves as they engaged in their research work that those who did not have membership did not seem to possess. And so first they had rhetorical savvy. What do I mean by that? I mean, they learned how to use language strategically to get their research work done. They also, and perhaps this is one way in which they learned it, is they participated in the activities of their disciplinary communities. So if they wanted to join a particular research community, they acted as reviewers and editors, and those of them who had probably been involved in that community for longer periods of time, they actually were able to shape disciplinary direction in those communities. They also mentored junior researchers, both in terms of research and administrative leadership. And they also participated in activities that sustained practice. What I mean by that is they sought funding for their research work. They sought collaborative grants. They sought their own individual grants. They, went from small grants and built up. But also their research work built on previous research. So they continued to the previous study, they built on that, they built in the next study. They weren't, in contrast, those who didn't have membership were sort of jacks of all trade. Those academics tended to do research over here and then come over here and do research on this issue. There wasn't something that really sustained their practice in that particular area of research. Finally, they had balanced research agendas. And this is what I think, I would argue, academics situated in the global north don't necessarily need to do as much of. When we're on the African continent, and again, this is a large generalization, but I urge you to reflect on this. Oftentimes, our geographical location overtakes the disciplinary issue in which we want to study. And I just want to give you an example of that from listening to one of the stories or the voice of one of the participants from the work I was doing, in which he talks about he was situated in the field of applied sciences, and he talks about this application for animal coding to a plow. He says, and that plow was an animal-drawn plow, and we did work on that with some experimental studies, and we had some results. Nobody would publish anything like that. They would immediately write to you. That is beyond the interest of our readers. We were also doing studies on something that's called the ramp press for oil expulsion, which was a manual one because that's what's being used in Africa. It's exactly the same. It's not of interest to any of our readers. So if you submit something like that to, and he goes on, to name some of the biggest journals in his field, that they're not interested. So he's limited, or the group of researchers are limited in that sense. So this obviously was someone who sort of sat in between these two, the periphery and those who had joined or had academics with membership, academics on the periphery versus academics on the membership, or that had membership. And in some ways, he was someone who had actually deviated away from his initial training, the area of research in which he had been, or the theoretical framework in which he had been sort of trained in, and was moving to engineering education because he found that easier. It was easier to get published in the international journals that he wanted to have recognition in. So I take this, I guess, to come back to these characteristics, is to really think about this kind of juncture in your own academic careers, your own the starting or wherever you are in your academic careers, is to think about how do you balance the research work that you might want to do very contextually to your location, geographically perhaps, and also make it something that contributes to the conversation that's being had disciplinarily in your actual research communities. So this leads us to, I guess, how to think about becoming rhetorically savvy. So the first thing I recommend is to determine your research community. What community do you want to belong to, or communities? And how might the findings, and if you're just beginning your research work, your PhD work, it might be hard to think about your findings. But if you were to think fast forward and sort of go there, to think about how these findings might contribute to the current conversations that are taking place in this research community. Also, it's about understanding and responding to the reader's expectations. So you have a PhD supervisor, but also when you publish in a journal, you have very clear expectations that are stipulated in the author guidelines about what the reader expects. And it's really trying to understand and respond to these expectations if we want to get published. But I think in addition to that, is analyzing and trying to mimic the rhetorical moves we see in the conversations we want to join. So what do I mean by this? A lot of the work I do with researchers who are trying to get published, researchers who are trying to finish their dissertations, is to go to those exact venues that they want to participate in, be it a specific journal, and try to see how are researchers in that field, how are they constructing the research gap? How are they talking about their methods? How are they talking about their findings or their results? How are they interpreting it? How are they concluding things? What are the moves that they're using in their conversations? And how might I mimic them? The next is also to ensure that one's research work always makes a disciplinary contribution and not just a contextual one. As you know, the quote we just saw from one of the participants is to really think about, yes, how is something, and this is where we can struggle as researchers on the continent, right? Because you see from editors at times that they can say, but this isn't really of interest, just like the participant's story I just shared with you. It's not of interest to our readership. But then what do we do, right? How do we use language in very strategic ways to perhaps sell it, quote unquote? Maybe that's not the right word or the best choice of words, but how do we make it show the readership that it actually makes a disciplinary contribution? Because I think, I'm thinking of Raewyn Connell's work, her text, Southern Theory, such an important book in which she really talks about the issue of generalizations. All research has context, but for some reason, context is sort of hidden in a way at times by researchers in the global north. And then finally, determining, and I talked about that a little bit in the last slide, determining how your work continues to contribute and build upon your previous work or publication, rather than becoming this jack of all trades. Those people who had membership to the most sought after communities, research communities in their disciplines, they did this. They built upon their work rather than seeing one publication over here, one publication over here that were completely maybe separate in focus from one another. So I hope in telling these stories, to conclude, because I see time is not on my side right now, this gives you some insight into what I mean by being rhetorically savvy. And hopefully from telling these stories today, this gives you some ideas about why a university writing center can be a very important place for you to visit sometime in your PhD trajectory or your PhD journeys. I'll leave you with some questions that you can ask yourselves and maybe take away from today's session. These are things, you can always write, think about, and you can think about these things at different times of your PhD journey, right? I think they become important, especially when we get blocks. So I'll leave it there. I thank you very much. And if we have time, can take a few questions perhaps.
Wow, Katie, thank you very, very much for that. It almost sounded to me like you were at the drawing table when the concept for AROCSA was being designed, because you've spoken right to the hearts, of the issues, engaging in research and disseminating that research. These are serious challenges, for African researchers, especially in the early stages. And there were many things you said, in your talk that I could directly relate to. And I'm sure that the students who are on the call today can also relate to. I'm sure even several of the faculty as well would have had some of these experiences. So one thing that jumped out to me, for instance, was when you said something about the writing controlling you. So when you start initially, you feel like you have no voice. Like, how do I distinguish my voice? And then I could also see how when you're trying to sort of develop some rhetorical savvy for yourself and you're mimicking, because you want to fit into the space, there's also a chance that you can lose your own voice at the same time. So another important thing that you said that jumped out to me is, what is your social motive for engaging in research? I think this is really, really important, and it's a question that all of the scholars here have to think about. So without further ado, I think we'll allow, if anyone has any questions, we can take about 3 questions before we jump into the breakout sessions. So does anyone have any questions? Please go ahead, Brenda.
Hi, I wanted to thank Katie for your presentation. And I just wanted to encourage the students on here, if you see work that you admire, approach that scholar as either a mentor or a potential co-author. Especially if you see someone, as a way, I think Katie's messaging about trying to emulate the kind of journal publications that you're seeking to achieve is just fantastic. And but you can also co-author with people who publish in those journals. And that's a great strategy as well. So I just wanted to add that in.
Great, thanks, Brenda. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so none at the moment. I think people are just really trying to digest all that you said, Katie. It was quite, okay, someone is saying something. So Enole is saying that the role of language and its appropriateness in research is critical. And I have cherished the presentation, especially about storytelling, because I am a storyteller. Great, great. Okay, so any other comments before we let Katie go and jump into the breakout sessions? So Katie, would you be kind enough to share your presentation slides with us so that we can share, because I thought it was really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure, I can definitely, because I think, especially those questions, I think it's a great thing. And Enole, just to go to what you said very, very briefly, I think this issue, there's a really great article, and I can share too, about burning questions. And I think when you're embarking on your PhD career, it's to think about what are burning questions for you, and then how to go to your discipline and see how those are burning questions as well in your discipline, potentially, without, Shani, you're right, losing your own identity, right? How do we do that? Because especially when so much of the conversation's coming from the North, how do we not lose our identity as scholars on the continent as well, right? But all of these things are at play, and I think that's why that makes our location at times particularly difficult to do this work, yet exciting, right? So, but yeah, I'll definitely share those with you.
Okay, great. So Ronnie has a question. Ronnie says, so with respect to finding your social motive for engaging in research, Ronnie is asking what could be wrong or misplaced social motives.
Well, I think in the South African context, one of the big pushes or social motives for doing research is money. I know at our institution, because it's primarily been a teaching institution, it's been a historically disadvantaged institution, we're encouraged to do research by monetary reward, right? We get 20,000 Rand for every article we publish in one of the journals accredited by our Department of Higher Education and Training. Unfortunately, some of those journals are predatory journals that are credited. They sneak in there, right? And then it takes them a little while to find out, and then maybe someone's published. Someone at our institution has recently published in the past year 50 journal articles. So you can see, which we know is impossible, right? But you can, single authored, by the way. So you can see, I would say that might be a little bit of a misplaced social motive, but it's a complex issue that we could debate for hours, right? But it's definitely, I have to say, if I can answer your question quickly, Ronnie, maybe, is those people who had membership, their social motives were complex and not just about personal gain. Their social motives for doing research were to inform the discipline, to have a national research agenda, to respond to a national research agenda like HIV and AIDS, which at that time in Botswana was a huge issue, as well as at the same time they were able to push forward the kind of disciplinary agenda. They took that contextual issue to Botswana and they fit it into their disciplinary context. And that was what they were doing action-wise, but I'd say it was also, there was a motive entwined in that. And they weren't just doing research for personal gain. There's no monetary value, as I know they would know, at the University of Botswana, but there's definitely a performance management system that governs one's actions with monetary reward attached to it. So, these are complex things I could talk about for a long time, but I'll leave it there.